The statistics suggest that if we cut our food waste by about 15%, that would be enough to feed 25 million more people. So it's quite clear that by being a little bit more frugal with how we use food and how we store it and also how we buy it, we could actually save quite a lot in terms of being able to help other people feed themselves. We also need to make other changes. We need to eat less meat, for example. Meat is an incredibly wasteful way of producing food. It takes about 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of beef, which is a really inefficient conversion rate. If that grain was grown as grain, it would feed 16 times more people than 1 pound of beef would. So we need to think about things like that. I'm not saying everyone should become vegetarian, but if we all cut down on our meat consumption a bit more, there would be more food again to go around for everybody. In my personal diet, for example, although I do eat meat and I really, really love meat, I'm now trying only to eat meat 2, maybe 3 times a week maximum, and I'm also trying to concentrate more on meat that doesn't need grain to feed it. So I'm buying things like lamb and goat because it's meat that feeds on wild pastures that can't actually be ploughed for arable farming. And I think we also just need to be more frugal with everything. My parents grew up with wartime rationing, and when I was a child in the 60s and 70s, we didn't waste anything because that mentality had stayed with them. So anything that was left over from the Sunday roast turned up in Monday's dinner with all the leftover meat and so on, and then what was left over from that went into something else, and finally the bones would go into a stock pot, and that would then get turned into a risotto or a soup or something. And we don't really do that much of that anymore. You know, we eat the Sunday joint and then we just chuck the carcass away. So I think we need to go back to that mentality of being more resourceful with our leftovers and using them up. And I think if we implemented even just a few of those measures, we would go some way to being less greedy ourselves and spreading some of the resources around a bit more.
In the spirit of the kind of the discussion we were talking about beforehand about being a bit more open-minded about the kind of things that we eat, prepared to eat things that maybe we wouldn't have eaten in the past. I've got something on me. I know there's mealworms and chocolate-covered crickets over there, but I've got something that's I know a lot of people think it's just animal fodder, but I've got one here. It's called a potato, and actually, although it doesn't look very promising, it's actually quite nutritious. What you do is you remove this outer skin. Well, you don't have to, but most people do. Chop it up in small pieces and then boil it, and then it's got, it's actually got vitamins and minerals and a little bit of protein and energy and stuff like that, and it doesn't give you leprosy. So that's good news. The reason I say that is that that's the kind of conversation that a certain Antoine-Augustin Parmentier was having in the middle of the 18th century in France. And he's just a good historical example of how you kind of have to, at certain points in history, we've changed our the way we think about food. So Parmentier was an army pharmacist who was captured during the war with Prussia and kept in a prison in Prussia. And he was fed potatoes there. Now, this is at the point at which France had just banned the cultivation of potatoes because they did think they actually caused leprosy. But Parmentier was fed these things, realised this was perfectly nutritious, and went back and made it his life's work to kind of try and popularise the potato and overcome a lot of the prejudice about it. So he would have organised dinners where the great and the good of French society, like Benjamin Franklin and Antoine Lavoisier, would come along, and he would feed them potato-based dishes to say, this is marvellous product, this is. And he even pulled off one stunt where he had these allotments, these test allotments out in Paris, and he put armed guards around these potato fields to try and convince people that there was actually something really valuable there. And he told the armed guards that if anybody came up to them and tried to bribe them so they could get in and steal some of the potatoes, they were to accept the bribe. So in various different ways, he spent his life sort of promoting these things. And by the time there was a bad harvest in 1785 in the north of France, the potato kind of came in and saved the day as a foodstuff, and took off from there. And I think that's I think it's entirely right and proper that every so often when we're faced with new problems that we try to reconsider the kind of things that we eat. So you can see things like that happening today. For example, when there's discussion about fish stocks, a number of different people are suggesting we try to eat different things. So instead of eating cod, we should try and eat pollock or gurnard. It sounds too ugly but anyway, apparently it's an alternative to cod. Another one is tilapia. Now, fish farming is really taken off. By the end of in the next few years, fish farming is going to overtake actual wild fishing as a source of fish. And one of the problems with fish farming at the moment is that salmon and trout and some of these fish are carnivorous fish, and so they need quite a lot of smaller fish to eat to provide bigger fish for us, whereas tilapia is a vegetarian fish, and it's already quite popular around the world. So that's it's something perhaps they could be promoted here as an alternative. Now, I don't think that eating bugs themselves is actually going to be necessary to feed the world. Although, as it happens, we eat snails already. Before I came here, I was across the road in Pret having a sandwich before I came, and I had a crayfish and rocket sandwich. I basically had a swimming insect and weed sandwich, and it seemed perfectly fine to me. So that was, but I think we're actually going to be finding ourselves using insects more indirectly. So there's I hope you've had your dinner, but there's a South African entrepreneur called Jason Drew, and he's promoting a method of using flies to create, or rather to recycle, protein. So the average fly, the average lady fly, produces about 1,000 eggs, and if you hatch them all and produce larvae, then they eat voraciously and very, very quickly. So what Drew's company is doing is hatching these larvae and giving them abattoir waste to eat. And after 72 hours of prodigious munching, these larvae have produced an enormous amount of larvae, an enormous amount of protein, and then they're extracted, dried out, and they're turned into animal meal. And apparently this is just as good as fish meal for animals and probably better than soy, which, considering that soy takes up a lot of land, particularly in South America, then that's probably quite a good thing. Having said all that, I don't think these technical solutions or these kind of interesting new variations on what we eat are strictly necessary in order to feed the world. I think if they can provide us with new and interesting types of food or make food cheaper, then that's great. But I'm not sure that they're particularly necessary. I think that ultimately these problems come down to politics and economics. And if we can solve those problems, then we're actually going to be in a much better position, even without sort of weird and wonderful foods. So, I mean, Louise mentioned food waste in the West, but in the developing world, that's, if anything, a much bigger problem. So, but in the developing world, it's all at the seat of production. So when food is produced and then harvested, very often there isn't good storage facilities, there aren't good transport facilities to get it to market quickly, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of food is ending up either rotting or food for rats. The agronomist Václav Smil has estimated that if all the low-income countries lose 15% of their annual crop of grain, that amounts to 150 million tonnes of cereals. That's 6 times the amount that's the difference between what hungry people would need to eat to make their diets into acceptable diets. There's about 800, 900 million people in the world at the moment who are malnourished, and just 1/6 of that shortfall in terms of food waste would actually make up that difference. So you can see that there's an awful lot of potential there for improving how we deal with food. And there's also big productivity differences between the developed world and the developing world. I mean, even something as simple as getting good access to fertilizer can make a huge difference. So Malawi in recent years has gone from being a food importer to a food exporter simply by the government essentially giving away fertilizer to farmers. I mean, that won't be the solution for every country, but it shows that by just providing the inputs and the know-how in certain situations, that you can make quite big gains quite quickly. And that's the kind of thing, certainly in Africa, that's going to be very, very important. The other big controversy is genetically modified food. I don't think, again, we need that to feed the world. I think it's much more important to deal with these economic and political issues. But nonetheless, I think we should definitely embrace genetically modified food, because it could provide a lot of food, eat more easily, with fewer inputs and deal with some specific problems. So, for example, in Hawaii, they've had a problem with a ring spot virus, which they've been able to solve by using a genetically modified version of a papaya. So overall, I think that, as I said, the biggest problem is poverty, and the biggest problem is food. If people have the money, then the food will be produced. So I think to feed the world, we really need to tackle poverty.
Well, we'll kind of try and introduce yet another perspective. One of the things that Louise said is quite interesting. For example, there are people threw food away that is just one day over their sell-by day. Or you talked about, you introduced when you said something about the larvae, you said, I hope you had your dinner. And Simon before said, well, if you want to try the larvae, and everybody was quite slightly titillated by that. Now, what all this, these different aspects, they're kind of bound together by one thing, and that's disgust. And one of the things which are directly connected to food and eating, and also, of course, the question of not eating, what we don't want to eat, is that we are disgusted by certain foods. We find it very difficult to stomach it. Now, part of the work, of my work, what I'm doing and what I'm interested in, is trying to find out the extent to which eating and anything connected with food is not just a very simple thing that we put something in our mouth and then it nourishes us, because if it were like that, we wouldn't sit here and we wouldn't have all these books about obesity conflicts, obesity crisis and eating disorders and feeding the world. But there's something about food which is intrinsically bound up with our own selves and with who we are. And food is something that is not uncomplicated. It's not something that we just eat. We never just eat. And I think that is one of the problems that we don't think about when we ask for for kind of easy solutions, because I personally think that there aren't any easy solutions. There's a very, very interesting concept by the philosopher Plato, and that's called the Pharmakon. And I don't want to go into the intricacies of it, and I'm oversimplifying here, but one of this, what he talks about, the Pharmakon is something that is medicine and poison at the same time. So if you have too much of it, or if you prepare it differently, it's poison. And on the other hand, if you have the right dose, it can be medicine, it can be helpful, it can be nourishing. So in a lot of theory at the moment about food and about eating, this concept of the Pharmakon is used in order to show how food is, on the one hand, something we desire, we are very passionate about, we love, and we sometimes feel we feel guilty about, but also something which scares us and something which we find threatening, and we feel, I've eaten too much again, and I've been very bad. So we kind of connect it to moral issues. Kristeva, in this very short article, basically makes a point which she much more eloquently develops in her book, how aspects of disgust of something that we want to put something externally inside of us, so in a way contaminate our own integrity, ourselves, and something which we then also find very disgusting when it comes outside again, when we expel it. So food, again, is not something stable, and it's precisely that aspect of food that it's not, food is in the process, is when we see it in front of us, it is in our mouth when it's mixed with spit, it's in our stomach when it's mixed with all the different digestive fluids, and it comes out as shit again. So which bit is the food? Yeah, what is that? What can we define as food? And as much as we enjoy it, it is also something that we, of course, want to get rid of and don't want to be seen with. And in a lot of philosophy and a lot of thinking about food, that has been, there's been a lot of thought about it, how this is basically eating or not eating or disgust has something to do with our own concepts, particularly in the West, of how we see ourselves as something where we conceive of the self as something that is separate from the outside. We are somebody and there's the outside, and the outside has nothing to do with us. So one of the theories is, for example, that we are, what we find most, what gives us anxieties is if there's something that we cannot define as either inside or outside. She gives a very interesting example, and maybe some of you will feel like that, and that's the skin on the milk. And I can see already some people immediately went, ooh, yeah. For some people, this is something very disgusting. And when you think about why is that disgusting, why do we find the skin on the milk disgusting? And her part of her theory is because it neither belongs to the milk, nor is it part of the outside of the milk. It is something that we cannot categorize, something that makes us, that worries us. And therefore, when we think about food, when we think about changes of food, it is not about the food, but it's ourselves we have to think about, and concepts, how we see ourselves.
So I'm going to give you my perspective as a crop scientist on feeding the world. And a lot of what I'm going to say is going to focus on my views about genetically modified food as an option. But if I have time at the end, then I'll take a slightly broader slant to it as well. So we've heard quite a few facts and figures already this evening. But to remind you, in round figures, there's about 1 billion people on the planet who are undernourished, about 1 billion people on the planet who are overnourished, in other words, obese, and causing problems for health services and so on, and about 2 billion people who are deficient in one or more micronutrients. So I'm talking about things like selenium, small molecules. And I don't think the genetic modification is a silver bullet. I don't think it's the absolute answer to everything, but I think it's a component of the toolbox that we can bring to bear on trying to feed the 9 billion people that are going to be inhabiting this planet in 2050. And I want to start by just giving you a little bit of information, really, because I know from my own experience lecturing to students that people don't have a hugely informed opinion about the range of GM products that are out there. So in my view, they fall into 3 types. Firstly, there's silencing of genes, or downregulation of genes. So for example, if you have a gene that's involved in promoting the over-ripening and rotting of fruit, so it does bad things to your fruit and shortens shelf life, if you silence that gene, which doesn't involve putting anything foreign into the plant, it doesn't involve putting a gene in from a different organism, this is downregulation, that can then promote shelf life. So that's the first type. The second type I would call overexpression. So this is taking a gene from an organism and essentially putting an extra copy of it back into that organism. So for example, if I have a gene that's involved in lycopene biosynthesis in tomato, lycopene, you may have heard, is one of these components that has some health benefits for you. So if I take that biosynthesis gene and put it back into the same crop, again, I'm not introducing anything foreign, in inverted commas. I'm just putting in extra copies of something that's supposed to be good for us. The third type is the one that causes the most controversy and gets people worked up. And this is where you take a gene from one organism and you put it into a different one. And the example I'll give here is that of golden rice that some of you in the room may have heard of, where genes have been taken from a bacteria called Owinia and from daffodils, things that are orange effectively, and put into otherwise normal rice. And it's called golden rice for a reason. It's because it turns up to be rather yellow in colour compared to your normal rice grains. And that's because it has the ability to make provitamin A. And as some of you may know, in many areas of the world that are highly dependent on rice as their staple food source, vitamin A deficiency is a problem, and that leads to various problems with sight in particular. So those are the sort of 3 areas. As I said, the last one is probably the most controversial. And I think primarily that's because it could never come about by conventional breeding or by using mutagenesis. It's something that you've definitely had to do an intervention to get. So the targets for this sort of thing, what sort of characteristics and traits would you want to use genetic modification to change? Well, we've probably all familiar with the easy ones, the ones that were, ones that were tried to be forced upon Europe a few years ago. Some of you that are as old or older than me in this room will remember perhaps the tomato paste that was around. That actually was quite a nice form of GM in my view, and involved modifying the cell walls of tomato to make them more easier to process. So you got a denser tomato paste, it used less water and so on and so forth. The ones that you will have heard of are things like herbicide tolerance, Roundup Ready crops, BT corn is the other one. So herbicide tolerance crops are tolerant to a herbicide called Roundup, which is glyphosate, and it caused huge controversy when it was when they attempted to introduce it into Europe, because essentially it meant that the company that made the chemical also made the seeds. They sold both to the same farmers. They wouldn't allow farmers to save seed, and it was a bit of a... Sorry, I'm just watching at the back. I think we may have a dog fight in the house soon. It didn't apparently benefit the consumer. I could just see that happening from where I was sitting.
I thought my dog had changed. Morphed into a dog.
The other kind of genetic modification that you've probably heard of is BT corn. This is a slightly better version of genetic modification because it essentially makes the plant produce its own insecticide. So it becomes resistant to the pest itself. So essentially you need to use less chemical. But there's a whole world of opportunity out there that probably most of you have only vaguely heard of at best. So current things in the pipeline that we're trying to get legislation for now in Europe make crops more tolerant to stressful environments. So in other words, we should be able to cultivate these plants in colder conditions, in drier conditions, in more saline conditions. Now, if I tell you right now in southern Spain, where all the salad crops are produced, there is a huge problem with salination of the soil because so much water has been abstracted from the soil. They're actually having to pipe water down from northern Spain in order to water the salad crops. These are the crops that you'll be eating between about November and March. So this is affecting stuff on your plate as well. The more advanced GM options are things like altering fatty acid composition, so increasing omega-3s in your diet and changing the omega-3, omega-6 ratio in some of the oil crops. This will come back to the fish debate that we heard a little bit about earlier, because at the moment, if you feed fish things like oilseed rape, it's completely the wrong mixture of oils for them, and it cannot replace carnivorous fish at the moment. But using GM technology, it may be possible to use plant-based alternatives. There are things like increasing lysine in maize. Lysine is an important amino acid. You find it in cereal crops, but not in maize crops. And so if you engineer maize, you can get a better balance of amino acids for nutritional benefit. So there are lots of things that you can do. Personally, I rather like the idea of eating a GM plant, because if I do conventional breeding, I take 2 genomes of about 30,000 genes each, at least, more if it's maize, and you shuffle the whole lot. And you don't really know what you've done. If you do GM, you take 1 gene, you know what it is, you know where you've put it and how it acts. And you can do lots of clever molecular things to work out which pathways it interferes with. So you have the capability of finding out what it's affected that perhaps you weren't looking for, as well as obviously looking at the target pathway. Because that's often one of the questions that comes up is, what if it changes something that you weren't looking for? How do you discover it? Well, we can do that. The other issue that normally comes up, or one of the questions, is what about pollen transfer? And you're absolutely right. Bees and wind don't get to the edge of the field, hit the brakes and go, oh, mustn't go any further, that's not GM over there. Of course it transfers. So does your conventional pollen. And a lot of the arguments against GM you could use against conventional crops. So if you look at the maize that you see growing in fields today, and you see tins that are labelled naturally sweet sweet corn, there is nothing naturally sweet about that. If you look at the wild maize progenitor, it was small, very, very hard, had about 6 little kernels on its cob, and that was it, and it didn't really look like food. And maize in particular, has completely manipulated mankind. for its own ends. We've bred it, we've selected it, we've given it lovely fields to grow in, we've nourished it and watered it, and it's now this wonderfully successful crop that has huge reproductive success. And that plant has totally influenced the way that we cultivate it. And you can turn the whole thing on its head and say, well, actually, plants have got the control, not us. So how much time have I got?
If you just start wrapping up now.
Okay, right. A lot of the points I was going to make actually have been covered by other people sitting with me up here about waste. I can add some figures to Louise's argument. The figures I've got from RAP suggest that about 36% of food that's produced in this country never gets consumed, whereas post-World War II it's about 2%. These days we spend about 8 to 10% of our income on food, whereas again post-World War II it was about 40% of our income. The question about eating less meat came up, and it was sort of neatly quite answered as well, that yes, we should probably eat less meat because it's way more efficient to produce plant-based food than it is animal-based food. On the other hand, you can't get a tractor onto Scottish hills or Welsh hills, and 4 legs go up it a lot more easily. So in places where you can only cultivate meat, this is what we should do. And I don't think there's a problem eating meat from those kinds of sources. I can talk about organics if you want me to. I can talk about things like integrated farm management, precision farming, something called seawater greenhouses, which is allowing desert areas to be cultivated and to produce useful crops in a very sustainable way. But I'm completely out of time. So if you want to know about these things, you'll have to ask me questions.